So we've had three marvellous papers dealing with quite similar issues in very different ways. We're in a luxurious situation now that we have a good hour to discuss the three papers, but also to discuss the papers and from yesterday as well, and some of the broader issues that this conference has raised. So I've got lots of questions myself, but I don't want to hog the situation, so I'll ask others to ask questions first. There's already a hand up over there. So, well, there are lots of hands up. Right, okay, so Nick got first. So Nick, do you want to start? And then we'll start working through some questions.
Yeah, so this is for Mark. I was thinking about Comfort's anarchism, and what you presented, I was intrigued by it. It seemed heavily individualistic, but his conception of sociability seemed highly moralized, right? As a matter of empathy and empathetic connection to others. And I was wondering if he was engaged with the work of Emma Goldman at all, because I think of her conception of anarchism as more communitarian, and whether he was engaged, and her conception of sociability is one of this kind of like, she talks of social wealth, right? Being free to organically collect and you know, I think of it as almost a kind of aesthetic, create a kind of aesthetic community. And I guess when I think about her work, I often think of like Dada and Surrealism as kind of like embodying maybe some of those conceptions of social wealth. And so it was striking to see a critique of that from an anarchist perspective, and noting that I was wondering, I guess, if Comfort's conception of sociability really is so moralized, or was he reading Goldman, or I don't know. But not a straight question, but a kind of curiosity, expression of curiosity.
A great question. Very interesting issues entailed in it. Just from the standpoint of somebody who's gone through Comfort's writings and things, I can't find any evidence of him having read Emma Goldman, but I can't see how he couldn't have, you know. She was such a famous and powerful figure that I don't doubt for a moment that he did. In terms of his anarchism, something that I find slightly problematic about it is it's so based on his theory of behaviorism, and he's a scientist and a medical doctor, and he studied child psychology. He was reading some of the texts that were referenced yesterday, like Erich Fromm, for instance, Wilhelm Reich, I'm sure he knew. So he's very interested in the psychology perspective on anarchism. And I think at times that led to a lack of sensitivity, shall we say, to the historical conditions under which anarchism could be achieved. Universalism across time, with this notion of something intrinsic to the human condition, which is an impulse or tendency. Sometimes I think the historical conditions under which those tendencies are reinforced sometimes dropped out a little bit too much. So I think he's excellent at theorizing the state's role in reinforcing these things. But when it comes to the other side of the coin, the issue of empathy, the way it can be socially constructed and reinforced, I'm not sure if he's explored that sufficiently. And I think Alan's incredible talk really showed how that could be done through life experience. I mean, that was amazing stuff. And, through art. And similarly with what Pat was saying, I see Comfort as somebody who is both admirable and problematic. That's the way I would see it. Yeah.
I think, Zach, you were next. Oh, it was James. Sorry.
My question's for Alan. I was wondering if you thought of Kevin's work as propaganda, and how you thought the talks yesterday by Sarah and Vid might inform our analysis of that sort of work, given that the interpretation is quite straightforward, or at least it seems that way. It's quite fixed. So yeah.
Prison Town is arguably propaganda, yeah. But what was that W.B.D. Du Bois quote? All art is propaganda. So I was kind of leaning into that when I was hearing that yesterday and saying, yeah, you can have excellent art that's also playing a propagative and instructional purpose. But I think inscribed within his work is when he's giving us these complicated stories and narratives, and the flipping of perspectives and so on, and the dualities. He's going a little bit beyond a prescriptive thing. He's triggering our imaginations to open us up to the perspective of not only the person who's being repressed, but also the repressor. and I could imagine myself as an objective psychologist working on the control unit, through reading Kevin's narrative. And the visual layering, I was trying to communicate it in the slides, is quite remarkable in terms of the expansive dimensions of the art, in terms of triggering imagination. Like the seriality of all the quotes of the prisoners, with the one prisoner who's grown huge inside the cell, for example, that kind of thing, preceded by the bureaucratic and dispassionate narratives. So that's a little more complicated than, I suppose, a typical example of propaganda, which is all about communicating one point of view. But I was pondering that too yesterday.
Sarah and Vid, I think, both want to come in on
before
this.
I respond, I had actually questions to each one of you, so maybe I proceed chronologically. I need to. So regarding the first talk, I was really interested, how did Dada feature actually in Alex Comfort's argument? Because there was one picture included on the Dada exhibition, right? So, but you didn't elaborate on that, so that was my question. And then for Pat, I was quite kind of intrigued because I was so unaware of this relation also to Bakunin. And I was wondering how Cartier-Bresson dealt with it himself, because obviously he was very much also appreciated by the art market and had like recipients and like admirers whom he probably would totally have hated. And I saw like interesting parallels to Richard Wagner, right? Because Wagner was also fighting on the barricades with Bakunin, but then he's now like kind of remembered as this right-wing German composer, right? But initially he started as a left-wing anarchist who wasn't allowed to be in Germany anymore. He was taught after. So that was something I wanted to ask you. And like regarding the third talk, I was really interested to hear more about how the prison industrial complex in the US differs from the treatment of prisoners in Canada, because I felt like, just given that you showed us these journals, it seemed that they are much more open to therapy, because I think in the US also, obviously it's an economic interest that they imprison so many people because it's cheap labor force, but also they don't kind of offer therapy to communities, especially black communities, who would really require this, right, who have psychological illnesses and then imprisoned rather than helped. So is there a difference in Canada, because there are these like kind of projects to have these engagement, participatory projects and kind of art engagement?
Thank you. Well, my answer is simple. I'm sorry. Keep forgetting this thing. He did not address Dada at all. Now, that photograph, of course, is from the Degenerate Art Exhibition of 1937, so he was aware of it. But he didn't address Dada, and I think it's particular to the situation in Britain during World War II and just before it, because of the introduction of surrealism and the power of surrealism as a medium, and the fact that, as Pat, I think, eloquently indicated, there were surrealists who identified as part of the anarchist tradition. And there's also this moment in time when André Breton, who's the head of the Surrealist movement, self-proclaimed, is trying to branch out to include some aspects of the libertarian anarchist tradition under the fold of the Surrealist movement. And he and Trotsky, for instance, write a joint declaration in 1938 where they talk about how Surrealism, yes, we do still believe in the party of the proletariat, but also within that context, one has to have a libertarian impulse of spontaneity and freedom from below. So there's an attempt to kind of square cube, or cube a square, whichever way you want to look at it. And Comfort was very, very critical of that. So to some extent, his intervention with Surrealism is very particular to the historical moment. But Dada, there's an incredibly rich history of Dada and anarchism. Alan and...
talk about the Eulenspiegel, right? As kind of Dada's positioning themselves also in the similar tradition like the Eulenspiegel.
Right, yeah, I agree. So, in a sense, it's very, with Comfort, you could see him, defining his discourse very carefully. Not talking about some things, talking about others. So, strategic is the way I put it.
As far as Cartier-Bresson, he actually was born into a wealthy family. The Cartier part of his name was a button and thread factory and concern, so that his his family had enough wealth to help him once they accepted the fact that he was going to be, I think it was not a lawyer, but an artist or a photographer. And he was wild, obviously, in relation to his family's expectations, just to do all that world traveling and live in Veracruz for a year and live in Harlem for a year. He was, at some point, they accepted it, and I guess they gave him a kind of annual income. Not huge, but enough for him to live the way that he wanted to. A lot of radical artists, that they were lucky enough that was true for them. Georges Seurat, Paul Signac, there are a lot of artists who, and in fact Paul Cézanne as well, although how radical he was is politically still, I think, a little bit of an open question. But anyway, so he wasn't really needing to market his art, although it's true that it ended up in museums, and especially the early work. But then after the war, after World War II, when he got out of the German prison camp, he wanted to found Magnum as a way to create a body of art that was, if not strictly propaganda, if we're going to see that as something that's too thin and pointed and only makes one point. I'm not sure I agree with that, but certainly he wanted his art to be persuasive, because I think from propaganda to persuasion is a sliding scale, and all art wants to be persuasive, just as all art has some political position, whether the artist wants to understand or grasp or articulate it. So anyway, he did become popular, but I don't think that he ever cared very much about what happened to the works afterward. He didn't kind of curate his own work. That one exhibition for the anarchist labor union was the only exhibition that I'm aware of that he actually organized in that way. I don't know, does that kind of address that?
Alan,
Probably more to say, but... Your question is challenging, but I can understand why you'd ask, of course. I guess that's the work that the art does, and given your own concerns. So I can answer this question somewhat anecdotally. Right now, the Canadian government is fighting against a successful, or at least to some degree successful, attempt to end solitary confinement in Canada, legal initiative was launched and had some successes on the lower court level, but the federal government continues to defend solitary confinement. Which is to say that the situation in Canada has been enriched by different communities that have been working to remediate the situation of imprisonment, not only outside of the prisons, but within the prisons. So there have been education. I have friends who used to go into some of the local prisons in the city where I grew up, which has many prisons, unfortunately, to do educational programs with prisoners. I also know people who have been incarcerated. One of them, Anne Hansen, has written a wonderful book, a memoir called Taking the Rap, which you might want to look up. It's called Taking the Rap. Her name is Anne Hansen. It's a follow-up to another book which talks about how she got in prison in the first place. But it's really remarkable because she talks about her original experience in prison in the 80s and then a few subsequent instances since she's on permanent parole for the rest of her life. A few subsequent instances where she was incarcerated again, and the observations that she shares about the evolution of prison techniques and so forth, and also observing some of the ways in which formally very constructive programs in prison and women's prisons to bring some sort of remedial purpose to the prison have been taken away, and the architecture itself is being rebuilt to facilitate surveillance, control, and so forth. And she talks about all these things from an experiential point of view. So I recommend her book if you want to get up to speed on what's been going on in Canada. I could also give you anecdotal tales of what has been done to people at protests afterwards when they've been incarcerated for brief periods of time and so forth. So that's anecdotal. In terms of the situation in the United States, there are various organizations that have documented what's been going on in the U.S. Like the Prison Town publication, that organization has lots more dealing with what's going on in the U.S. So, and there's a whole movement across North America called the Prison Abolition Movement.
I think also through Black Lives Matter, and a lot of information evolved about how Black people are, and that's how I kind of got aware of how serious the situation is.
Yes. Well, you might be interested in the archive. I'm the director of an archive at University of Victoria, an anarchist-focused archive, and we have the papers of Jim Campbell. All the publication, like the full run of this prison news service and everything, and it's just fascinating in terms. You can actually track prisoners writing in and talking about how much it means to them, writing poetry, and so forth. You have intersections with Black Panthers becoming anarchists, indigenous activists talking about their struggles within the prison and so forth. It's a very, very rich archive.
Vid, I think, had a question for all three, and then, yes, Dave after Vid, and Mona and Zach. We've got a lot of questions. Okay, Vid, you go.
Thank you all. So my question comes from a conversation that I had with Pat and Mark out just over coffee, which is that perhaps, naively we tend to think of anarchism as kind of a movement really focused on the political aims of dismantling the state. And, we sort of, in the kind of popular imagery, it's the kind of the bomb thrower sort of image. Whereas in both of your talks, right, and especially in the kind of concept of ethical anarchism that Cartier-Bresson offers, it seems that it's a much more a position kind of focused. It's almost like a humanist position, one that's really focused on the kind of the dignity of the individual, and that's kind of the primary motivator. So my first question is really, to what extent that rings true, and secondly, if we really go back to the art, right, how that comes across, perhaps in the centrality of the human figure, perhaps in all three artistic practices that you've talked about. So, yeah, just an invitation to talk about those two issues.
I think that's very important. The assumptions about what anarchism is in the popular imagination really have to be countered with more careful historical treatment and articulation of the enormous range. I mean, there were anarchist bomb throwers. There is an association with terrorism that's perfectly historical that we need to acknowledge. It's not that they're all cute and fuzzy, in the end. But many anarchists are pacifists and don't subscribe to that. In fact, there were very fierce debates throughout the 19th century and certainly, I'm sure, to this day, about whether people supported the idea of a symbolic act of violence, which was in the 19th century called the propaganda of the deed. So there's the propaganda of the word and the propaganda of the deed. The throwing of a bomb of nails into the Chamber of Deputies in 1894 by Auguste Vaillant was intended simply to injure. I mean, it's not nice, but it wasn't intended to kill anyone, and no one was killed, and he was executed for it. So there's this kind of disproportionate, in a way, reaction, although there was a very deadly bomb that took place just a few months later. Someone who was avenging his guillotining. So there was this kind of escalation. This whole period ended in a trial of 30 people. Two of them, I think it was, were actual thieves who'd been caught robbing a bank, and then the other 28 were intellectuals who had advocated various aspects of anarchism. So in France, this became an enormous issue that kind of everybody sort of had to take a position on. If I recall correctly, Kropotkin defended it up to the Émile Henry bombing that killed 8 people. That was thrown at the voters. It was thrown into a cafe. So it was not people who were actually political people, but people who had voted them into power. And so there was this long, rather tortured defense of that notion that the voters were guilty of perpetuating the system of injustice. So because there was an enormous disparity in wealth in France in this period. Kropotkin defended it until it got too uncomfortable, and other people continued to defend it, like the art critic Félix Fénéon, if any of you know him, actually seems to have been a bomb thrower himself, as well as an aesthete who was a friend of Mallarmé. I mean, it's such a wonderfully complex world, clearly, and then other people had never, ever supported any act of violence whatsoever. And only believed in sort of community building instead of these symbolic acts of violence. So anyway, anarchism certainly has this very checkered, life in public imagination that I think makes it extremely difficult just to deal with the ideas that it generates. But if you're going to be a historian, you really have to open your eyes to that whole range.
Just following up on some of what Pat said, there's a paradigm in anarchism that goes back to the 19th century and carry forward, and I think has become more and more powerful as a central value within anarchism. And that is the notion of the state, not as a fetishized object that you can destroy, but as a state of mind. and a set of social relations between people. How do people relate to each other? How does the state intervene and formulate those relationships? And I think both Pat and Alan really touched on that in a central way. And I did in my own way with talking about objectification of the self and the other, and the way in which Comfort theorized that in terms of human psychology. So human psychology, social relations, a core value within anarchism is transforming that. And this can be what Alan referred to in his abstract as a form of prefigurative anarchism, where you think about anarchism in terms of not some horizon line of revolution, but in terms of the kind of incremental changes you can make in your own life and your relationship with others. So in that sense, anarchism is happening right now, and in the choices we make, in the way we relate to each other, whether we follow Donald Trump and demonizing people, or, other kinds of relationships that we might want to establish as an alternative to that. So I think that's a fundamental aspect of what anarchism was about. And the terrorism thing is a very complicated issue, because to some extent there's what Pat was indicating was a distinction between symbolic terrorism, where one would kill, say, or assassinate a figurehead who stands for the state, or the issue of, as she was pointing out, this kind of almost indiscriminate bombing, where you're attacking voters for their desire to elect representatives. So they're part of the structure by which the state is created. So,
right, exactly.
I mean, where does that end, That's a problem.
Do you have anything to say to Vid, or we can move on today?
Well, are you aware of what's going on in northern Syria right now? That territory is anarchist. The Kurdish anarchist movement is very strong. I was just in Turkey and had an opportunity to talk about what's going on there with someone who's Turkish and Kurdish and an anarchist. And what strikes me about that is the way in which their territory has served as a refuge for all these people who are fleeing the intolerance, ethnic and religious based, that suffuses, the ISIS project and so forth, and the Kurds actually going out to save the Yazdezi people who are marooned on a mountain and besieged, which the ISIS people were actually, killing all the men and enslaving the women and so forth. So that's a very, very vital struggle, and it's not only a struggle of opposition against these forces that they're in revolt against, and it has become an armed struggle by virtue of who they're fighting against. But it's also a struggle of renewal. There's a very, very rooted feminist component to their conception of an anarchist society. There's also a very strong, powerful ecological component, because the Syrian state had done things like cut down all the forests and so forth, tried to control those people in that region by turning their agricultural livelihood into monocrop-based production and so forth. And so they are also engaged in the renewal, the ecological renewal of those lands, at the same time as they are besieged not only by the Syrian forces of Assad, not only by the remnants of ISIS, but also by the Turkish state itself, which has invaded part of that territory and been working in allegiance with some of the most reactionary, sectarian, religious-based militias going. So, which is to say, as Mark was saying, that there's also this constructive side to anarchism that we shouldn't lose sight of, which is simultaneously social. So that's just, we can talk about that at another time.
Dave.
Thank you. And thanks to all three of you for a insanely compelling set of case studies that we looked at. And I also have questions for the whole panel, but I'm not going to do that. I'll make that dinner conversation. I'm going to single you out, sorry, Mark. I'm going to start by suggesting that the reading that Alan had us do was, quite objectively clear why he wanted us to look at one case study. And also, Pat, the video you had us watch certainly gave some information. But I'd like to mention a conversation that Brian and I had in the vehicle on the way up here. As to, we couldn't quite figure out why you had us read Orwell's painfully pragmatic, humorously truculent ad hominem attacks, or responses, shall we say, to Savage and Comfort via the editors of Partisan Review. We debated as to how is Mark going to tie this to his discussion of Comfort's pacifism, because we read the abstract, we knew you were going to talk about Comfort, and you didn't quite tie that into your work. And so for some of us who maybe haven't read it, you might want to give a summary of this fun read, but it ended up being the focus of our conversation. What's Mark Antliff going to do with this thing? So could you talk about that reading a little bit?
I was having fun. There's nothing like lack of resolution to encourage conversation. And what's really amazing about all that, as both Pat and Ellen know, some of you might also know this, Orwell himself, in the moments leading up to the war, was himself a pacifist. He was involved with these anarchists and was in a dialogue with them. And at some point, I think in 1941, he described himself as having a gut feeling that he had to defend his country. So, this is somebody who himself is going through a degree of torment as to what his position is. And, of course, he evolved still further, right? Writing in 1984, and he was in sympathetic dialogue with these anarchists. When a group of them were arrested in 1945 before the war ended, specifically because they were involved in spreading anti-war literature among conscripts, he was involved in a defense committee to support them. So Orwell is a very troubled, interesting, problematic figure. And I just wanted to put that out there to give you a sense of what it would be like to be a pacifist in 1942. And as you probably know, Partisan Review is a Trotskyist magazine, too. So, it was open to other tendencies on the left, but it was really to give you a kind of feel for what was at stake on the left and the kind of dialogue that was going on and the problematic status of it. That was my basic message. And I thought that it would be interesting to leave it open-ended.
Yeah, it was fun to read. But,
yeah.
His almost convincing pragmatic defense against when you do nothing, you abet the enemy. Mm-hmm. When he started to see the atrocities of the other side, he doesn't deny the atrocities of the Allied forces, but he doesn't seem very confused at this moment in time.
Right. Yeah, he's quite sure of himself at this moment in time, which is very interesting. Yeah, I'd have thought that just disappeared because I was awake at 5:30 in the morning for some good reason. Maybe it'll come back to me. Yeah.
I think Zach, and then I think Mona. Or did you not want to have I got that wrong?
No, I did. I just was unclear about that.
Okay, if you go first, and then Mona.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much for really fascinating talks. I have a fairly narrow question for Pat. So I was very curious about this, the Magnum agency or not agency. So one of the interesting things about photojournalism, especially for artists with a political or activist bent, seems to be that you can get work in front of people or get worker perspectives in front of people who might not be seeking it out. And I was wondering if Magnum's self-conception was to do that, and in particular whether if they had what their strategy was for publication venue. So if they were particularly trying to place their work in nonpartisan venues.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think they were. They were targeting the magazine's look and life, and in European parallels like Paris Match, and lots of ones really across the board. And if you, I grew up in the 1950s, so every week a look and a life arrived on my doorstep, and so in a sense it was the internet of the day, in the sense that this is what brought imagery to you about the world. It was a source of information. I think that it was very often also a kind of, maybe I don't want to overuse the word propaganda, but it certainly was about persuasion. Look and life, I think, celebrated the American way of life and kind of naturalized consumption and wealth as values that everybody should be aspiring to, with the attendant myth of everybody could have it if only they worked hard enough. And so it was a perfect place to put information about decolonization, for example. Or I'm thinking about W. Eugene Smith doing his series on Minamata, which was about mercury pollution of a town in Japan. Horrifying photographs of children being born with terrible deformities, so that they're completely dysfunctional people. And then you get all this information about mercury poisoning. So it would go back and forth. Some of them were very anodyne and innocuous, and then other stories would be extremely powerful and informative. So I think it was a perfect venue to put photographs that could be, in their way, making an argument for tolerance and understanding of vast cultural differences across the globe. Certainly, Cartier-Bresson himself chose to do Asia, and so he was in India during the liberation and the founding of the Indian nation. He was in China right after the revolution. He really sought out these places where there was radical social change going on, and he would photograph the people so that they were expressing recognizable emotions that would be shared with the people back in the States or in France, anywhere in Europe, whatever. So the audiences in general were in Europe and North America, which is important to understand. But Magnum was really founded to make a humanist message of egalitarianism and the right of everyone to their own self-determination. So that was his political conviction, and why he went to those places where people were breaking free of the colonial system. Yeah.
Okay, we have Mona, and then we have Brian, and then we have Nick.
So I have one question for Mark, and then an invitation for an extension of the discourse for Alan. So given Alex Comfort's main ideas, thinking about anti-militarism and pacifism, and his refusal for conscription, and condemning the carpet bombing. If you want to extend that trajectory to the current moment that we're living at, how would you think that thesis would be applicable today, considering the military-industrial complex, and if you would think about, instead of carpet bombing, the use of nuclear weapons, how if you think that would be applicable in any way today. And then Alan, reading The Prison Town, I think it's worth extending that conversation a little bit, because he did a meticulous job coming up with all the stats of how the state in particular benefits substantially economically from building the prisons, and how that funding system works, and the fact that actually a little minority of locals do get hired into this system. I think it's worth maybe talking about that a little bit. So I think that would maybe create more conversations. Thank you.
I remembered what I was going to say. Before I answer that brilliant and interesting issue, and that is that I was also interested more seriously, aside from putting you in the atmosphere, very uncomfortable, of 1942 being a pacifist. All the thinkers that are, or the anarchists who are making their statements, are practicing what Alan has referred to as prefigurative anarchism. They're saying you cannot fight fascism with fascist methods. So this is in the wake of the Spanish Civil War and in the wake of the Russian Revolution, when a lot of these leftists were looking back and they were saying, well, what went wrong, with those revolutionary moments? And what they came increasingly aware of and talked about, and this was within the anarchist pacifist movement as well, is the organizational methods by which violence is effective. And what violence invites is hierarchies, military hierarchies, authority, central control authority from top-down management. And in the initial stages of the Spanish Civil War, the anarchists were trying to do away with that, as an organizational principle within the context of violence. But, it was subverted. There are very complex reasons why that didn't happen. But ultimately, many concluded, well, violence is not an answer because it's bound to fail. And so they put their faith in people like Gandhi, in nonviolent resistance, which doesn't mean just doing nothing. It stands for subverting the infrastructure by which the state imposes hierarchies and seeks to control and monitor every aspect of human organization. So there was an attempt very much to rethink the necessity of violence within the context of revolution. And I wanted, that to be an underlying discourse that you might think about. And I think it came out in all of our talks as a central theme. What I found so interesting about what you said is this notion of objectification. Alan and Pat both talked about the need to practice empathy and not to objectify. And when we think of the military-industrial complex and the prison complex, as Alan pointed out, or the commodity complex, as Pat pointed out in the case of prostitutes, it's all about modes of objectification. And what I find really disturbing, if I were Comfort and thinking like him today, is the way in which the military has reinforced the sense of objectification in terms of spatial distance. So you have drone warfare, where people are, controlling these things like video games, and in fact, real lives are being lost, The nuclear horror, the fact that there could be that annihilation, and for Comfort's generation, and I imagine for Jeffrey's generation as well, and mine, well, all of us really, it's still out there. The notion of a bomb being launched and in like 30 minutes, or actually 30 seconds, I don't know, 2 minutes or 3 minutes, it's exploding somewhere else. to great annihilation, that's a real issue as well. So Comfort, in the wake of World War II, became involved in the anti-nuclear movement because he saw science as increasing the capacity for destruction, and also this distancing issue that he saw with aerial bombing, being greatly exaggerated. So you don't have actual physical contact with the so-called enemy at all. He saw this as a very pernicious thing, psychologically, as well as in terms of infrastructure. So,
thank you for your suggestion, Mona. I should say that this is part of a book I'm completing called The Aesthetics of Tension, Anarchist Currents in Contemporary Art. And one of the challenges as a writer is the word count. And but also I tried to address Kevin's research side in my discussion of Lab USA in the larger chapter. But I take your point well, that research, the factual dimensions, which the art, of course, reinforces and humanizes and turns into an experiential thing in a complex way. The complexity I initiated signaling at the start of my talk is fascinating to me, and I can't think of anyone who's really dealt with that complexity, the multiple viewpoints and so forth, the way I am. So I'm trying to achieve a new way of looking as well through the writing, and some things just have to fall by the wayside a little. But I take your point, yeah. Those statistics and the information in Prison Town are amazing and eye-opening and transformational.
Thank you. This isn't a question, it's really a comment. And I feel compelled to make it because I'm a neophyte art historian in spite of my age. And I've sat through a lot of papers over the decade, and I've never experienced being moved in the way that I've been moved this morning. To have one's mind challenged, to have information, but to somehow also touch the heart, and in the course of doing that, to absolutely model what you're talking about of ethical anarchism. So I just wanted to thank you for that. This was probably one of the greatest experience, one of my greatest experiences of my student career. And all I can say is I feel totally intimidated that I have to talk this afternoon. But thank you. And Alan didn't reveal, but I'm going to, why I feel so moved. I was the warden of 2 federal penitentiaries, as well as the director of the John Howard Society of Alberta, which was the reform movement in the 1970s. So I feel touched in a way, and I'm so grateful that there are people and organizations that are doing this, because it's so highly necessary. Thanks to all of you.
Well, thank you.
What a wonderful comment. I pity poor Nick having to follow that, but you are, and then Zach will be following Nick.
Yeah, I was going to say that was a lovely comment, and now I'm sort of speechless. But what was I going to say? Oh yeah, Pat, you touched on this, so this is sort of an invitation to say more. But I was interested in why Cartier-Bresson chose photography, given his clear ethical anarchist aims. And I was reflecting on this, and I thought, and maybe I'm reading too much into the image that you emphasized in your talk at the beginning and the end, but there's an interesting kind of critique of representational art that is not photography, because if you see the man's sort of climbing a ladder, right, and leaping off of it into the ideal, and behind him you have a representational image of that, sort of captured by art. But in front of him you have the photographer and the image that we have, which is in a way a more profound depiction of that leap, that sort of aesthetic leap into the ideal. And so anyway, I just thought if you sort of thought that was an interesting reading, and maybe is that somehow capturing his thought that photography is especially good at playing a role in sort of the aesthetic realization of the best form of life. And I just one more comment. There was a time, I think you were quoting Cartier-Bresson when you were talking about liberty through liberty or something like that, or was it?
I think that was Bakunin.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because that sounds exactly to me like Schiller's fundamental law of the aesthetic state, which is Freiheit zu geben durch Freiheit, to bestow freedom by means of freedom.
I can't speak to who might have influenced Bakunin. Yeah. However, that's very interesting. You've touched on something really dear to my heart, which is the power of photography as an art form, because I think that one of my approach to studying the history of photography and my teaching of it has always been trying to teach people the ways that the photographer is manipulating the viewer. So the photographer, just like any other artist, wants to persuade, wants you to respond in ways that come into harmony with the way that they're seeing. Artists can say as many times as they like that the viewer can respond however they like, but artists generally really actually have a desire about how they want you to receive the work of art, and that's photographers have scores of ways to control that have to do with framing and angle of vision and where use of light and dark, the moment, how much motion they want to stop, what kind of blur, what kind of lens. It's just an amazing. Basically, a photograph is an abstraction. It's just, or it used to be anyway, and for Cartier-Bresson, it is a range of black and white on a two-dimensional surface. But photography gets to conjure with that sense that it has captured real life. And a painting, it's really hard for a painting to do that because you know that it's paint and you know that it was created. So photography has that extra power to make you think that it's neutral. And that's the power that photographers play with and play on in persuading you of their vision. So that's why I wanted to show the negative of that famous photograph, which is such a mess. You would barely see what was really there. And then just the reframing, created this decisive moment. And so I think that he did actually start as a painter. And he was, he studied in the studio of André Lotte, who was a kind of, can we call him a second-tier cubist, who came along a little bit later in the Cubist movement, but still in the pre-World War I period, and then later had a studio where he taught principles of composition. And so Cartier-Bresson did, in fact, have this underlying artistic training that has everything to do with him, noticing the half circle as against the diagonal of the train roof, and he can see those things instantly, no question, because he has an extremely trained eye. And later in his career, when he got into his 80s, he decided he would just be an artist again, and he, from there on, he stopped doing photography and just did drawings. They're nowhere near as powerful as the photographs, in my view. But it is sort of interesting to suggest the awareness that he had every time he took a photograph, that he is composing as an artist to set up a basic frame, and then he's waiting for life to happen in that frame. So it is really a very brilliant technique in that sense, that it focuses on this moment when his feeling is right, but that in fact it's been set up pretty darn carefully. He used to wait for hours in places where he knew something interesting could happen, and then sure enough a bicyclist would finally go by, you know. That's my basic thought about the extra power of photography. And maybe he wasn't such a great painter, too. I don't know. Because, you know, painters can do powerful things when that is their medium. I mean, he really did find his medium with the camera. Yeah. Great question. Thanks.
Zach, did you have something to ask?
Yeah, sure. If there's time. I don't
Yeah, there is
or
time.
if
We've
else.
got 10 minutes before lunch. So Zach, and then I think Levi, and then James. Okay, we've got loads of questions.
So my question is from Mark, and this is a sort of curiosity about the state of play in psychology at the time, and how that was an influence in comforts thinking. So you mentioned that one of the criticisms that you had is of his how behaviorism came into his thinking. But another strand of thought that you brought up is that you described him as very concerned about neuroses that come up from war or what have you, which, you know, at least in contemporary years sounds like a very Freudian term, is a, you know, term most associated with Freudian thinking, which you can see as in essential tension with behaviorist thinking. So I was wondering how those were reconciled in his own thought, if they were, or what, how he, you know, worked through both of these approaches.
That's a really fascinating question, I think, because it's so problematic, especially from our perspective today. In as much as the psychologizing that went on at that time was largely in a Freudian or Jungian frame. And particularly the Freudian thing, you know, it saw other kinds of sexuality as aberrant. So one has comfort theorizing the notion of neurosis, but also sexuality as part of it. So the joy of sex, which I mentioned later, I mean, in terms of his trajectory, he was thinking healthy body, healthy mind, but it was defined in terms of a notion of freedom that was circumscribed, I think, by heterosexual relations. So in that sense, there was a real limitation to the way in which he was ultimately thinking of that. So, you know, the fear of death, he wanted us to get over that fear of death. He saw it as fundamental to this flight from reality and belief in supra-individual entities, and to a bad psychology of self-objectification, objectifying others. And I can see all that as operative. What he later went on to do is try to advocate sexual expression as a life-affirmative biological thing that could stretch to include, you know, a healthy psychology as well. Or was an expression of a healthy psychology. That's a more correct way to put it. So you won't be surprised to find that he ended up in California in the 1970s. Very much a part of experimental lifestyles and institutions at that juncture. So I find the psychology element both edifying and also, you know, there's a horizon to his thinking that he didn't get beyond within the context of how he was working through these issues. But he was not alone in that. Like Wilhelm Reich, Erich Fromm, who I mentioned as well, were theorists that he was looking at. So a lot of people, I think, and you know, we have the same experience today with Donald Trump, where people are trying to think about behaviorist readings of Trump and his behavior, misbehavior. And it's not wrong, but one has to be careful about psychologizing too much, because, you know, we have to think about social conditions as well in a very serious way as something contingent.
Okay, we've only got a few minutes, so I'm going to ask us to do all the questions. I think Karun's got a question as well as Arash as well. So if we can have the 4 questions straight after each other, and then keeping answers as brief as possible. So it was okay. So it's Levi. Sorry. So Levi, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, this question's for Pat, and kind of building on Nick's previous question to you and your answer. And mainly about unpacking more the relationship between technique and what is offered through what that technique produces, that point of view. And especially considering photography, maybe in the way Ansel Adams more thinks about is this building up of technical choices that result in what is conveyed. And you mentioned how Bresson saw his technique as not having purpose, it is the point of view that matters. But then later talked about it's impossible to separate content from form. And so I want to maybe see what you understood more about how Bresson sees technique influencing what comes across, because it seems to be really important in terms of how he establishes himself as a photographer and what he is able to convey in terms of his anarchistic values, both through the documentary honesty of the scenes and in the compositional formalism. So, and thinking about that relationship between technique and what's conveyed, maybe even more broadly through art that we can even see in Rubenov's work, you know. So.
Yeah. Cartier-Bresson thought of himself as not caring much about technique. He was basically what I would call somebody who was anti-craft. Coming after Edward Weston, where you have this incredibly fussy, or Adams, you know, who's Westonian, a really careful sort of control of technique. And Cartier-Bresson was careless. I mean, I looked through everything owned by the Getty, and I was just shocked at the bad quality of some of the prints. It's just unbelievable. You know, I mean, it's something that would have been much, easy to make a little bit better, but they would have a really weird range of tones, no real darks, no kind of lustrous areas. So he just would make his negatives and hand the film to someone else to print. And he didn't care much about the quality. So, I mean, that to me is really an anti-craft notion that goes along with Dadaism in many ways, and some of the surrealists anyway. Just kind of saying what matters to him is the act of living, and in that act of living to express a vision at a certain moment. And that's, I think, in other words, the decisive moment isn't, how can I put this? Because it's both in the photograph and in the photographer. Maybe that's the way to put it. The decisive moment is when the photograph and the photographer are at one in this moment of exposure. That he has carefully, he is like a hunter. He's sneaking up on it and waiting for then the moment to come, and then he grabs that moment. And he describes it as a moment when in that one quote, his mind, his eye, and his heart all come together in that moment. So the fact that it results in a photograph with power, of course it doesn't always. I mean, I'm sure there were many failures. He was careful never to show us his contact sheets. Other photographers, you can look at their contact sheets, like Deanne Arbus or Gary Winogrand, and you can see, here's the red circle around the one that really, really worked. You get the feeling that Cartier-Bresson did many fewer, but whatever he didn't like, he destroyed. So there was a kind of careful control about what ended up coming through. But he, so that he has this funny relationship to technique. Obviously, it matters enormously in as much as it's the means by which he conveys any artistic vision at all. But I think he always felt he was on the other side of it, and the photograph was an almost accidental result of what he was doing. I mean, that sounds pretentious because, he ought to admit that the product was the thing that ultimately mattered. But I think in his own mind, he wasn't telling himself that. Yeah. There were some other features of what you were asking that I think I dropped there.
I guess another feature I was asking was the relationship between maybe technique and art, or what is able to be conveyed more broadly.
Yeah.
But you kind of covered it.
Well, no, but I think that an artist's stated aim needs to, for any interpreter, I think you need to look at the stated aim as if it's also a work of art. I'm looking at the artists here and I'm thinking, how are they hearing this? But, as someone who is a writer about art, and I don't feel like I'm an art critic, I'm an art historian, but I'm also just a viewer. I'm the beloved reader. I'm just someone receiving the work of art. And I think in that sense, artist statements. I mean, I started out working on Picasso, who was a great liar. Talk about a fool. He would lie. I mean, he said, "Oh, when I was a child, they gave me a guitar and I never painted another one." Oh, really? Well, I can show you 800 guitars he painted after that, after he was 8 years old, but it's just so funny. He just loved to spin these myths that would puncture other people's assumptions about him as a Spanish artist. So, but he painted millions of guitars. So there is a lot. I mean, an artist will say things that themselves bear interpretation in relation to the work of art. So, and I think Cartier-Bresson's statements similarly, and Jeffrey's too. I mean, I think that you need to see the statements in relation to the work, and then ideally in the setting where they matter, in their historical period, in their the way that they were received, the way that they sought an audience. All of those things need to be seen to kind of understand how a work of art can function in its moment and then forever, for as long as it's going to last, for ever new audiences who lose the context that we're living right now. And that's to look at a photograph from 1932 and kind of understand the state of industrialization and industrial waste and pollution, and then the human joy in the midst of all that. It needs both a context, but it also transcends that. So that's part of the power of art, I think.
That would be a wonderful place to finish. But I just want, because I love when the students ask questions, I'd love Arash and Ambreen to just ask their questions together, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you for the wonderful talks. I'm just wondering the relationship between gender and anarchism. As you have already spoke about the case studies and male artists, I'm wondering, are there any female feminist anarchist artists that you can talk a little bit about? Thank you.
It seems that all the artists that you talked about are political activists. I'm curious, what is the difference between a political activist and an anarchist? Thank you.
Well, if I may answer the first question, there are many women who are active as artists in the anarchist movement. I've been working on one of them. Her name's Frida Gutman. She's based in Montreal, and she does amazing installation work related to the issue of Palestine and her own identity growing up in Montreal and the Jewish community and so forth. Very incisive. So that's one avenue, one instance I could point to. There are many others. In terms of political activism, we're all political actors in one way or another, but actually most profoundly when we're in denial of our responsibility towards the world. One of the things that inspired me so much about Jeffrey was the way in which he pointed towards that responsibility in relation to the act of writing about art, being an art historian. And also the way in which he wanted to expand the dialogues the creative act and what that means, and whether there's it can be an avenue for knowledge about ourselves and also an understanding about the world we occupy. So so I think much in the way as all art is propaganda. We're all political activists. It's just a matter of what you choose to pursue in that regard.
Well, that is a perfect place to finish. And what a testament to the 3 papers that an hour was nowhere near enough to get through the things we wanted to discuss. And I had a good dozen questions that I refrained from asking. So we're now going to have... So can we actually thank the 3 speakers?